When it comes to Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, there's a comfortable narrative that's taken hold in popular imagination. It goes something like this: Hitler was an idiot. The invasion was obviously doomed from the start. Everyone could see it was suicide. Napoleon tried it and failed, so Hitler should have known better. It was just stupid. But here's the thing about history: it's remarkably easy to be wise after the event. When you already know how the story ends, when you've seen the frozen German soldiers outside Moscow, when you've witnessed the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, when you know that the Red Army eventually stood triumphant in Berlin, it becomes almost impossible to see the situation as it appeared to those who lived through it. We look back through a lens colored by hindsight, and we forget that the people making these decisions in 1941 didn't have our vantage point. They couldn't flip ahead to the last chapter to see how it all turned out. So today we're going to do something different. We're going to examine Operation Barbarossa not through the lens of what we know happened, but through the eyes of the military and political professionals of 1941. We're going to look at what they knew, what they could reasonably have concluded from the information available to them, and why so many intelligent, experienced people across multiple nations believed that the Soviet Union would fall quickly to a German assault. This isn't about justifying the invasion or its horrific consequences. It's about understanding that even catastrophically wrong decisions can be based on what appears to be reasonable analysis at the time. Because if we're going to learn anything useful from history, we need to understand not just what happened, but why intelligent people made the choices they did with the information they had. The question we're really asking today isn't whether Operation Barbarossa failed. We know it did. The question is whether it was obviously, stupidly doomed from the start, or whether it was a gamble that looked far more reasonable in June 1941 than it does from our comfortable position in the 21st century. The world before Barbarossa. A different reality. To understand how military professionals viewed the Soviet Union in 1941, we need to step back and consider the context in which they were operating. Nearly everyone in a position of authority in the Second World War had experienced the First World War in some capacity. They had either fought in the trenches, witnessed the carnage, or spent their formative years studying it. That war had established certain truths in their minds about what modern warfare looked like and what it required. For Germany specifically, the Great War had created a particular set of lessons. On the Western Front, the German army had found itself locked in a brutal stalemate that lasted 4 years, consuming enormous resources and countless lives for minimal territorial gains. But on the Eastern Front, things had been dramatically different. The war there had been far more mobile, and German forces had consistently achieved victories against the Russian Empire, eventually knocking Russia out of the war entirely through a combination of military defeats and internal collapse. So from a German perspective, they had succeeded in the East with what they considered their second-rate forces, while failing in the West despite committing their best troops. Then came the events of 1939 and 1940, which seemed to validate an entirely new way of warfare. In September 1939, Poland, a nation that had proven to be a tough adversary in the First World War, fell in a matter of weeks. Then, in the spring and summer of 1940, came the truly shocking development. France, which had been Germany's most formidable opponent in the Great War, the nation that had withstood 4 years of German assault, was conquered in a mere 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, all fell like dominoes before the Wehrmacht's advance. The psychological impact of these victories cannot be overstated. In the First World War, Germany had thrown everything it had at France and still couldn't achieve a decisive victory. Now, in 1940, with new tactics and mechanized warfare, they had accomplished in weeks what their fathers couldn't accomplish in years. The German military had achieved something that seemed almost miraculous, and it fundamentally changed how they viewed their own capabilities. This wasn't just German arrogance. Military observers from around the world were stunned by what had happened in France. The speed and completeness of the German victory suggested that something fundamental had changed in warfare. The old assumptions about defensive strength, about the power of prepared positions, about wars of attrition, all of these seemed to have been overturned by the German development of combined arms tactics, particularly their use of concentrated armored formations supported by air power. So by mid-1940, Germany had demonstrated twice in rapid succession that modern mechanized warfare could deliver decisive victories with incredible speed. They had defeated enemies that should have put up far more resistance based on First World War experience. The Wehrmacht appeared to be an unstoppable force that had discovered a new formula for military success. This is the context in which Operation Barbarossa was planned. Not arrogance born from nowhere, but confidence built on recent, spectacular successes. Soviet military performance, a trail of troubles. If German confidence was one side of the equation, the other side was Soviet performance, or rather, the lack thereof. Because between 1938 and 1940, the Red Army had given military observers around the world plenty of reasons to doubt its effectiveness. The first warning sign came in July 1938 at the Battle of Lake Khasan, a relatively obscure clash on the Soviet-Manchurian border. Soviet forces had moved to fortify heights near the lake when Japanese forces attacked and defeated them. Stalin personally ordered a counterattack, and the Red Army eventually pushed the Japanese back, but only by committing forces that outnumbered the Japanese at least 3-1. Even with this massive numerical advantage, Soviet attacks were repeatedly beaten back with heavy casualties before they finally succeeded. The performance had been lackluster at best, suggesting serious problems with Soviet command and control, coordination between different arms, and battlefield effectiveness. Then came the invasion of Poland in September 1939. The Red Army attacked 16 days after the initial German invasion, at a point when Polish forces were either retreating from the Wehrmacht or actively engaged in fighting it. Polish resistance to the Soviet invasion should have been minimal at best. Yet even against this already defeated and disorganized opponent, the Red Army faced serious problems. Supply issues, communication failures, poor coordination. All of these problems manifested themselves against an enemy that was barely able to resist. While the Germans had sliced through Poland like a hot knife through butter, the Soviets had struggled even when facing token resistance. But these were relatively minor affairs compared to what came next. The Winter War against Finland from November 1939 to March 1940 was a disaster that shocked the entire world. Stalin demanded territorial concessions from Finland, a nation of just 3.7 million people. When Finland refused, the Soviet Union attacked with overwhelming force. Approximately 1 million Soviet troops against fewer than 300,000 Finns, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, against a Finnish force that had virtually no armor and barely over 100 aircraft. By all conventional military logic, this should have been a walkover. Instead, the Finns made the Red Army pay for every snowflake with blood. Finnish forces used their knowledge of the terrain, their adaptation to winter conditions, and their superior training to inflict catastrophic casualties on Soviet forces. The Red Army demonstrated poor leadership at every level, inadequate winter equipment, terrible coordination between infantry and armor, and an inability to adapt to the terrain and conditions. Supply lines broke down, troops froze to death. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed by forces a fraction of their size. When it finally ended in March 1940, the Soviet Union had technically won, forcing Finland to cede some territory. But the cost was staggering. While estimates vary, the Soviets suffered somewhere between 126,000 and 167,000 dead, with many more wounded, against Finnish losses of about 26,000 dead. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would later recall that all of the Soviet leadership, and Stalin first and foremost, sensed in our victory a defeat by the Finns. The Winter War had been a humiliating demonstration of Red Army weakness, and the world took notice. Military professionals across the globe watched these performances and drew conclusions. The Red Army appeared to be poorly led, inadequately trained, suffering from severe organizational problems, and unable to cope with even limited warfare against much weaker opponents. If they struggled this badly against Finland, what would happen when they faced a truly formidable military machine like the Wehrmacht? The shadow of the purges. There was a reason for the Red Army's poor performance, and everyone knew it. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin had conducted what became known as the Great Purge, and the military had been decimated in the process. This wasn't just a matter of removing a few troublesome officers. It was a wholesale destruction of the Soviet officer corps that stands as one of the most intensive peacetime destructions of a nation's military leadership in recorded history. The numbers are staggering. Of the WW2 63 officers who held general-grade military ranks in 1936, approximately two-thirds were arrested within 2 years, and nearly half of those arrested were executed. 3 of the Soviet Union's 5 highest-ranked officers were killed. All but 4 of the 29 most powerful officers in the Soviet military structure were removed from their positions. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, arguably the most brilliant Soviet military mind of his generation, was arrested, tortured until he confessed to absurd charges of working with Germany, and shot. The purge reached down through the ranks as well. Approximately 35,000 officers were arrested over the course of 1937 and 1938, though the exact numbers remain uncertain. But the purge didn't just remove bodies. It removed experience, knowledge, and most critically, the most competent officers. Recent research has shown that Stalin specifically targeted not just potential political threats, but the most capable officers. Younger officers who had achieved high rank early, demonstrating exceptional competence, were particularly likely to be purged. Stalin was eliminating not just his current rivals, but anyone who might pose a future threat to his power, and competence was seen as dangerous. The effect on the Red Army was catastrophic. By 1941, roughly 75% of all Red Army officers had held their positions for less than 1 year. The average corps-level commander had only 16 years of total military service, about the same as a contemporary American battalion commander, and they were 12 years younger on average than their German counterparts. The institutional knowledge, the experience, the professional development that should have existed had been systematically destroyed. This wasn't secret information. While the full extent of the purges might not have been known in the West, the basic fact that Stalin had decapitated his military leadership was widely understood. Military attachés, intelligence services, and observant journalists had all noted the disappearance of prominent Soviet military figures. When Western observers watched the Red Army's poor performance in Finland and Poland, they could point to a clear, visible cause. Stalin had destroyed his own military's effectiveness in a fit of paranoid fury. Moreover, the purges hadn't really ended. Even as Germany prepared for invasion in 1941, Stalin continued to arrest military officers. In early June 1941, just weeks before Barbarossa began, Stalin initiated another wave of purges targeting the Air Force. So not only had the Soviet military been gutted in 1937-1938, but the process of terror and disruption was ongoing right up to the moment of invasion. From the perspective of German and Western military observers, the message was clear. The Soviet Union had taken what might have been a formidable military force and systematically destroyed its leadership, its competence, and its ability to fight effectively. Combined with the visible evidence of poor performance in actual combat, this suggested that the Red Army, despite its large size, would not be able to mount effective resistance against a modern, well-led military force. Western assessments, a consensus of doubt. What's particularly revealing is that these dim views of Soviet military capability weren't limited to the Germans. British and American assessments, drawn up by professional intelligence services with no stake in justifying an invasion, reached remarkably similar conclusions. In 1939, British chiefs of staff had predicted that if the Soviet Union attempted full-scale military mobilization, it would likely lead to a complete breakdown of the economy. This wasn't just prejudice speaking. It was based on observations of Soviet economic conditions, reports about poor living standards, and intelligence about the strain that even limited military operations were placing on Soviet logistics and industry. The Polish campaign, and especially the Winter War, seemed to confirm these assessments. British and American observers noted that the Soviet mobilization system appeared unable to cope with even the stress of limited warfare. The Red Army had struggled to supply its forces in Finland, despite the fact that the war was being fought practically next door to major Soviet population centers. What would happen if they had to supply and sustain forces across the vast distances of their own territory? Then there's a particularly telling document from June 1941, just before Barbarossa began. Brigadier General Carl Nelson, the U.S. Army's Assistant Chief of Staff, submitted a detailed memo to the Chief of Staff assessing Soviet military capability. Nelson was a professional military officer with no ideological axe to grind. His job was to provide an objective assessment of Soviet strength. His conclusion? Germany could rapidly defeat the USSR, overthrow Stalin's regime, and seize the Soviet Union's western provinces. He believed that total destruction of the Red Army was possible in 1941, opening Germany's path all the way to Lake Baikal in Siberia. He concluded that the German attack on the USSR was a sound military operation if launched by July 1st, with reasonable chances of full success prior to winter setting in. This wasn't some Nazi propagandist talking. This was a senior American military officer analyzing the situation with the information available to him, reaching the conclusion that Germany could win. And he wasn't alone. British assessments showed similar patterns. American and British intelligence services looked at Soviet industrial capacity, military performance, economic conditions, and political stability, and they concluded that the Soviet Union was in a precarious position. Even the French had underestimated the Soviets. In 1939 and early 1940, before their own defeat, French and British planners had seriously considered bombing Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. The goal was to cut off oil supplies to Germany, which was receiving Soviet oil under the Nazi-Soviet pact. But the very fact that they were willing to risk bringing the Soviet Union into the war against them suggests they didn't view the Soviets as a particularly dangerous opponent. They were more concerned about German access to oil than they were about Soviet military power. The perception wasn't that the Soviet Union was laughably weak. Rather, it was that the Soviet Union had enormous potential, vast resources, huge manpower, but that Stalin's purges, economic mismanagement, and political instability had prevented them from translating that potential into actual military power. The industrial base was there, but it was inefficient. The population was large but poorly fed and equipped. The territory was vast, but the transportation network was inadequate. This was a giant with feet of clay, powerful in theory but unable to mobilize that power effectively in practice. What's crucial to understand is that these weren't just German assessments designed to justify an invasion. These were the professional judgments of military intelligence services in Britain, America, and France. All of them looked at the same evidence and reached similar conclusions about Soviet weakness. They might have differed on details, but the broad consensus was clear. The Soviet Union was not prepared to fight a major war, and its military was not capable of standing up to a modern, well-equipped opponent. The bright spot. Khalkhin Gol. Now, there was one significant piece of evidence that pointed in the other direction, one demonstration that the Red Army could be effective. In the summer of 1939, at a remote spot on the Mongolian-Manchurian border, Soviet and Japanese forces fought a series of battles known as Khalkhin Gol, or the Nomonhan Incident. Under the command of a relatively unknown general named Georgy Zhukov, Soviet forces inflicted a decisive defeat on the Japanese Kwantung Army. The battle demonstrated several things that should have worried German planners. It showed that Soviet combined arms tactics could work when properly executed. Zhukov coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air power effectively, achieving the kind of deep penetration and encirclement that the Germans themselves prided themselves on. The battle showed that Soviet equipment, particularly tanks, could be effective when used properly. It demonstrated that Soviet forces could conduct large-scale offensive operations successfully. So why didn't this change the assessment? Why didn't Khalkhin Gol make military professionals reconsider their views about Soviet weakness? Several reasons. First, it was a single battle in a remote location. The scale, while significant, was limited compared to what a full European war would involve. It was easier to dismiss as an anomaly than to take it as representative of true Soviet capability. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a victory against the Japanese, not against a European power. This might sound like racist thinking, and to some degree it was, but it also reflected military realities as they were understood at the time. The Japanese army, while formidable in its own way, had shown significant weaknesses in its war with China. German observers who had watched the Japanese campaign in China had concluded that the Japanese would be unable to match a European army in combat. So a Soviet victory over the Japanese, while impressive, didn't necessarily prove that they could stand up to the Wehrmacht. Third, Zhukov's victory could be explained away by other factors. The Japanese had been attacking, were at the end of long supply lines, and were operating in difficult terrain. The Soviets had committed carefully selected units, many with combat experience from the Spanish Civil War. It was possible to argue that this was the Red Army at its absolute best, with ideal conditions, against an opponent that wasn't quite first-rate. And even with all these advantages, Soviet casualties had been heavy. Finally, and this is crucial, Khalkhin Gol was just one data point against a weight of contrary evidence. The Battle of Lake Khasan, the Polish campaign, and especially the Winter War all painted a picture of Soviet incompetence. Khalkhin Gol was the exception, and in intelligence analysis, you don't usually overturn your entire assessment based on a single exception, especially when there are plausible explanations for why that exception might not be representative. So while Khalkhin Gol should perhaps have received more attention than it did, it wasn't unreasonable for military analysts to weight it less heavily than the multiple demonstrations of Soviet weakness that had come before and after it. The pattern seemed clear, and Khalkhin Gol was an outlier in that pattern. The Napoleon comparison, history's seductive but flawed parallel. At this point, many people bring up Napoleon. After all, Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, and his Grande Armée was destroyed. Surely Hitler should have learned from this example? Isn't the comparison obvious? The problem is that the comparison, while superficially appealing, falls apart when you examine it closely. Yes, there are surface similarities. Both invasions involved moving large armies into Russia's vast territory. Both eventually ran into supply problems. Both armies suffered terribly from winter conditions, but the differences are far more significant than the similarities. Let's start with technology and communications. In 1812, Napoleon's army moved at the speed of men and horses. Messages between different parts of his army traveled at the speed of a horse. Communication with Paris took weeks. In 1941, the Wehrmacht had trucks, trains, and aircraft for transport and supply. They had radio communications that could coordinate units across hundreds of miles in real time. They had aerial reconnaissance to see enemy positions. The entire operational tempo and capability of warfare had been transformed. The scale and scope of operations were completely different. Napoleon essentially moved in a single concentrated mass toward Moscow. The French occupied a relatively narrow corridor through Russian territory. In contrast, Operation Barbarossa involved a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 1,800 miles wide. The Germans were simultaneously advancing on Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and into Ukraine in the south. This wasn't a single arrow thrust. It was a broad front occupation of territory on a scale Napoleon never attempted. The timeline tells an even more important story. Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed into Russia on June 23, 1812. They reached Moscow in early September, stayed for 5 weeks, and began their retreat on October 19th. By December 25th, the last remnants of the Grande Armée had crossed back out of Russia. The entire campaign, from invasion to evacuation, took place in a single year. The Wehrmacht's experience was radically different. They invaded on June 22, 1941, and were still attacking in early December. Even when driven back from Moscow, they maintained their positions and continued to occupy vast swaths of Soviet territory. They weren't completely expelled from Soviet soil until 1944, 3 years after the invasion began. The staying power of the Wehrmacht, their ability to remain combat effective under conditions that destroyed the Grande Armée, was incomparable. The quality and composition of forces also differed dramatically. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a multinational force with French troops making up only about half of the total. Many of the foreign contingents were of questionable loyalty and capability. The army was already showing signs of declining discipline even before the invasion began. Contemporary accounts describe widespread looting, breakdown of unit cohesion, and morale problems that became catastrophic after Moscow burned. The Wehrmacht in 1941, by contrast, was at the peak of its power and efficiency. According to the German Army's own assessment, 136 divisions were rated as capable of offensive and defensive operations in summer 1941. This was the same military machine that had just conquered most of Europe. Their training, equipment, and tactical proficiency were on a completely different level from Napoleon's mixed bag of troops. Moscow itself played different roles in the two invasions. In 1812, Moscow was important primarily as a political and symbolic target. Napoleon hoped that capturing it would force the Tsar to negotiate. In 1941, Moscow was the communications hub of the entire Soviet Union. All major rail lines radiated out from Moscow. Capturing it would have crippled Soviet ability to move forces and supplies across their territory. The operational importance of Moscow in 1941 far exceeded its importance in 1812. But perhaps the most important difference is this: the military professionals planning Barbarossa weren't ignorant of Napoleon's example. German planners explicitly studied the 1812 campaign. They concluded that the circumstances were sufficiently different, that Napoleon's failure didn't doom their own attempt. And honestly, looking at the evidence available to them, that wasn't an unreasonable conclusion. The military capabilities, technology, and strategic situation were so radically different that trying to apply lessons from 1812 to 1941 was like trying to apply lessons from medieval cavalry charges to modern armored warfare. The Napoleon comparison is seductive because both invasions failed, and we naturally want to draw parallels between failures. But the fact that two invasions of Russia both failed doesn't mean they failed for the same reasons, or that the second failure was predictable based on the first. The circumstances were simply too different. The strategic calculus, the two-front war question. Now let's address the obvious question. Why would Germany invade the Soviet Union when Britain was still fighting? Isn't this the classic blunder of opening a two-front war? On the surface, this seems like a slam-dunk criticism. Germany fought a two-front war in the First World War and lost. Now Hitler was deliberately creating another two-front war. Obviously stupid, right? Not quite. The situation was more complex. First, we need to understand what alternatives Germany had. After the conquest of France, Britain was isolated but still fighting. The Luftwaffe had failed to win the Battle of Britain, and the air campaign against British cities was failing to force a surrender. So how could Germany defeat Britain? The obvious answer might be invasion. But here's where many people underestimate the difficulty of amphibious operations. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was essentially impossible with the resources Germany had available. Amphibious landings require complete naval superiority, and Germany simply didn't have it. The Kriegsmarine had been badly damaged in the Norwegian campaign and was no match for the Royal Navy. Building enough naval power to contest British naval supremacy would take years, not months, and would require dedicating enormous resources to shipbuilding. Even if Germany could build the ships, which was doubtful, naval power takes time to develop. You can't just build a battleship and immediately have an effective navy. Crews need training. Tactics need to be developed. The ships themselves need sea trials and shakedown cruises. Creating a navy powerful enough to protect a cross-channel invasion would have been a multi-year project, and during that time, the German army would largely sit idle. The Mediterranean strategy offered another alternative. Focus on North Africa. Push toward the oil fields of the Middle East. Perhaps force Britain to negotiate by threatening their empire. But this strategy had two problems. First, it would primarily require naval and air power, not the massive ground army that Germany had built and that represented its greatest strength. Second, it wasn't clear that success in the Mediterranean would actually force Britain out of the war. The British had shown remarkable tenacity. Simply taking territory from them hadn't been enough to make them quit. So from Hitler's perspective, launching an invasion of the Soviet Union had certain perverse logic to it. His ground forces were at peak strength. The Red Army appeared to be weak and poorly led. German intelligence estimates suggested the campaign could be won in a matter of months. And crucially, Hitler believed that once the Soviet Union fell, Britain would finally accept reality and make peace. Without the hope of Soviet assistance and facing Germany as the master of all continental Europe, Britain would have no choice but to negotiate. Was this logic correct? No, obviously not. Britain didn't make peace after the Soviet Union was invaded. They became Soviet allies. The campaign took far longer than a few months. Soviet resistance proved far more determined than expected. But the point is that this wasn't obviously stupid at the time. It was a calculated gamble based on what appeared to be reasonable assumptions about Soviet weakness, British isolation, and Germany's own strength. Moreover, from a military planning perspective, letting the Red Army continue to rebuild and rearm while German forces sat idle wasn't particularly attractive either. If you believed war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and the evidence suggested it probably was given the ideological gulf between the two regimes, then striking while the Red Army was still recovering from the purges, and while German forces were at peak strength, had its own logic. Again, this doesn't make the invasion wise or justified, but it does mean it wasn't obviously stupidly doomed from the start. It was a gamble that didn't pay off, taken by people who had reason to believe they could win based on the information available to them. What intelligence couldn't see? So why did all these professional assessments turn out to be so wrong? What were the military analysts of 1941 missing? Several crucial factors were simply invisible to Western intelligence services. The Soviet Union was a closed society, far more opaque than Nazi Germany. Getting reliable information about Soviet industrial capacity, resource stockpiles, or military reserves was extremely difficult. Intelligence services could observe Red Army performance in battle. They could count divisions and estimate equipment numbers, but they couldn't see the full picture of Soviet state power. They didn't know, for instance, about the massive industrial mobilization capacity the Soviet Union possessed. The Soviets had spent the 1930s building heavy industry in the Urals and Siberia, far from Western observation and far beyond the reach of German bombers. When war came, entire factories were picked up and moved east, continuing production even as the Germans advanced. This kind of resilience and determination wasn't visible beforehand. They also underestimated Soviet society's ability to endure catastrophic losses. Western democracies had learned from World War I that there were limits to what populations would tolerate. Massive casualties could lead to political collapse, as had happened in Russia in 1917. But the Soviet Union under Stalin operated under different rules. The regime's total control, combined with genuine patriotic resistance to invasion, meant that Soviet society could sustain losses that would have toppled most other governments. The sheer reserve of manpower was another factor that was hard to assess from outside. The Soviet Union's population of around 170 million people provided an essentially inexhaustible source of soldiers. The Germans estimated they faced about 200 Soviet divisions at the start of Barbarossa. By December 1941, they had destroyed or badly damaged most of those divisions, yet the Red Army had somehow fielded new formations to replace them. This kind of mobilization capacity was difficult to predict from pre-war assessments. Western intelligence also couldn't see that the Soviets were learning from their mistakes. After the Winter War disaster, there had been a major post-mortem in Moscow. Commanders analyzed what had gone wrong. New tactics were developed, equipment was improved, and organizational changes were made. This process of institutional learning wasn't visible to outside observers, who could only see the Red Army as it had performed in 1939-1940, not as it would perform in 1941-1942. The geography of the Soviet Union was understood in theory, but its practical implications weren't fully grasped. Everyone knew Russia was big, but understanding what big meant in terms of supply lines, communications, and the ability to trade space for time required actually experiencing it. The vastness of the territory, the poor state of roads, the distances involved, all of these were calculated factors, but calculation and experience are different things. Finally, there was a failure to anticipate how ideology would interact with practical military factors. The Nazi invasion wasn't just a military operation, it was explicitly genocidal. German policies in occupied Soviet territories were so brutal that they turned potential allies into determined enemies. Soviet citizens might have been ambivalent about fighting for Stalin, but they fought ferociously to defend their homes and families from an invader who made clear he intended to enslave or exterminate them. All of these factors, invisible or underestimated in 1941, combined to create a very different reality than what German and Western intelligence services had predicted. The Red Army was badly led and performed poorly in the early stages of Barbarossa, just as predicted. The difference was that the Soviet Union found the will, the resources, and eventually the leadership to continue fighting despite these early disasters. The knowledge available in 1941. Let's take a step back and synthesize what military professionals actually knew in June 1941. They knew that the Red Army had performed poorly in every engagement since 1938, with the sole exception of Khalkhin Gol. They knew that Stalin had systematically destroyed his military leadership in the purges. They knew that the Soviet economy appeared to be under severe strain even in peacetime. They knew that Soviet logistics and supply systems had failed even in limited conflicts close to Soviet bases. On the other side of the ledger, they knew that the Wehrmacht had just torn through Europe like a buzzsaw. They knew that modern mechanized warfare, as practiced by the Germans, could deliver decisive victories with unprecedented speed. They knew that Poland fell in weeks, France in 6 weeks, and that these weren't weak opponents by historical standards. They also knew about the precedent of the First World War, where Germany had ultimately succeeded in knocking Russia out of the war through a combination of military defeats and internal collapse. They had seen how political instability could lead to military collapse, as happened in Russia in 1917. Given this knowledge, the assessment that the Soviet Union would fall quickly wasn't unreasonable. It was wrong, spectacularly wrong, but it wasn't stupid. It was a professional military judgment based on the best information available, and it was a judgment shared by intelligence services of multiple nations who had no interest in justifying a German invasion. The problem with hindsight is that it makes the right answer seem obvious. We know the Soviet Union didn't collapse. We know the Red Army, despite catastrophic initial losses, continued to fight. We know Soviet industry performed far better than anyone expected. We know geography and logistics proved to be greater obstacles than anticipated. But the people making decisions in 1941 didn't know any of this. They had to make judgments based on incomplete information, recent performance, and historical precedent. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If Operation Barbarossa had been conducted slightly differently, if Moscow had fallen in 1941, if the Soviet leadership had panicked and sought peace, if the German supply situation had been handled better, the invasion might have succeeded. The margin by which the Soviet Union survived those first terrible months was narrower than we often acknowledge. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 was a desperately close-run thing. If German forces had been stronger, if Soviet reserves had been weaker, if winter had come later, the outcome might have been different. The point isn't to say the invasion was a good idea. It clearly wasn't. The point is that it wasn't obviously doomed from the start. There were scenarios plausible based on 1941 knowledge in which Germany could have won. Those scenarios didn't happen, but they weren't absurd fantasies. They were reasonable possibilities that didn't come to pass. Conclusion: not stupid, just wrong. So where does all this leave us? Was Operation Barbarossa just stupid? No. It was many things, but it wasn't stupid. It was based on flawed assumptions, incomplete intelligence, and ultimately catastrophic misjudgments. But it wasn't the obviously doomed venture that it appears to be in retrospect. The decision to invade was made by military professionals who had access to the best intelligence available at the time, who had studied the problem carefully, and who reached conclusions that, while wrong, were not unreasonable given the information they possessed. This is an important distinction to make. Calling something stupid implies it should have been obviously wrong at the time. But Operation Barbarossa wasn't obviously wrong in June 1941. It looked like a risky but potentially winnable gamble. The German army was at peak strength. The Red Army looked weak and disorganized. Recent German victories suggested that modern mechanized warfare could deliver quick, decisive results. British and American intelligence services, with no stake in the invasion, had reached similar conclusions about Soviet weakness. The problem is that we judge historical decisions by their outcomes rather than by the information available when they were made. The invasion failed, therefore it must have been stupid to try. But that's not how decision-making works. You can make a reasonable decision that turns out badly. You can take a calculated risk that doesn't pay off. Being wrong doesn't mean being stupid. Understanding this matters because if we simply write off major historical decisions as stupid, we learn nothing. If Barbarossa was just Hitler being an idiot, then there's nothing to analyze, nothing to understand, no lessons to draw. But if we recognize that intelligent, experienced military professionals made judgments that turned out to be catastrophically wrong, despite seeming reasonable at the time, then we can start asking more interesting questions. What information were they missing? What assumptions did they make that proved incorrect? How could they have known better? These are the questions that actually help us understand history and perhaps avoid similar mistakes in the future. The execution of Operation Barbarossa had many flaws. The planning made numerous errors. German logistics were inadequate. Strategic decisions, like the diversion of forces from Moscow to Ukraine in August 1941, were questionable even at the time. But the fundamental decision to invade, while ultimately disastrous, wasn't obviously stupid, based on what was known in June 1941. History is full of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved catastrophic in retrospect. The difference between wisdom and folly often only becomes clear after events have unfolded. Operation Barbarossa is a prime example of this principle. It was a gamble that looked far more reasonable in the summer of 1941 than it does from our vantage point. It failed not because it was obviously doomed, but because the reality of Soviet power and resilience exceeded what any intelligence service in 1941 could have predicted. The real lesson of Operation Barbarossa isn't that Hitler was stupid. It's that even extensive intelligence gathering, professional military analysis, and careful planning can lead to catastrophically wrong conclusions when dealing with incomplete information. It's a lesson about the limits of knowledge, the danger of assumptions, and the terrible consequences when major decisions are made without understanding all the factors at play. If you found this examination of Operation Barbarossa through the lens of 1941 knowledge rather than hindsight useful, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the like button to help others find this content and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Were you surprised by how reasonable the invasion looked based on pre-war intelligence? Do you think military professionals should have known better? I'd love to hear your perspectives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.